Barely elected and already sparking international controversy. Brazil's future president Jair Bolsonaro said he will go ahead with plans to move the Brazilian embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, following the footsteps of the United States.
As previously stated during our campaign, we intend to transfer the Brazilian embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Israel is a sovereign state, and we shall duly respect that.
Words welcomed by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who congratulated the decision shortly after. Bolsonaro showed strong appreciation for Israel throughout his political career, claiming Brazil would profit from building closer ties with the country. In 2016, the president-elect visited Tel Aviv and met members of the Knesset and the Minister of Agriculture. Since then, he has repeated that Brazil should adopt Israeli agriculture strategies to cultivate food in the semi-arid northeastern region, and that Israel is willing to share its technology. Brazil's Jewish community largely backed Bolsonaro's candidacy, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has hinted that he will be attending the presidential inauguration in January. The close ties between the two leaders risks undermining Brazil's relationship with Arab countries. Bolsonaro has said he does not recognize the state of Palestine and threatened to close its embassy in Brazil, a move that would break away from former Brazilian policies and their support for the Palestinian cause.
What kind of a maneuver do we have here? What kind of flexibility will President Putin have in this regard? How are you going to convince Bashar Assad for the necessity of establishing a constitutional committee, especially until the end of this year? If I were to list you the methods, it wouldn't be very constructive. In order for the advancement of these efforts, we need to be calm, we need to be respectful. We have to respect the legitimate government of Syria. Everyone's referring to Syrian regime, but according to the resolution of the United Nations Security Council, it is referred to as the Syrian Arab Republic government. By respecting the Syrian legitimate government, and with the intention of having positive contacts with the opposition, as we've always been inviting them to have a positive contact with us, and by basing our efforts on the final declaration of today, until the end of this year, when the conditions mature, when the circumstances avail themselves, the Constitutional Committee will be established and will become operational. In the Syrian National Dialogue Congress, it was decided that a Constitutional Committee should be formed. And after that, we've had agreements with Bashar Assad and the opposition representatives. Two sections were formed on behalf of the regime and on behalf of the opposition. We have built two lists of names, and we are building a third list incorporating the NGOs as well. These are very challenging efforts, as all of the stakeholders are willing to incorporate their trusted representatives. But if no trust will be built vis-à-vis this Constitutional Committee, no benefit can ever be derived. Both in Syria and in Iran, we will keep on talking with our stakeholders, and we need to have our consultations. Iran is one of the guarantor of the peace process, and they are one of the guarantors of the ceasefire to be sustained.
Again, on the eve of an election, with the clear intent of firing up the Hispanic conservative base, U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton arrived in Miami and threatened more sanctions against Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba. Notwithstanding what you or I think of those particular countries with all their maladies, what Bolton did and what the U.S. is doing right now, more and more these days, actually has a name. You're not going to believe this. We just found this out. It's called the CNN effect. It's called the CNN effect. Seriously. It's so named by the Brookings Institute. It's a respected think tank that studies the use of sanctions, threatened sanctions, and the effect of threatened sanctions. By the way, here's how it defines it, okay? It defines the CNN effect, right, as a way of increasing the visibility of problems in some other country by stimulating the desire on the part of Americans to respond. In other words, they use CNN, right? They use CNN to play you. It's right there. I mean, you know, CNN effect. Policy brief number 34. Can you imagine? This brief also goes on to state that most often these sanctions, quote, turn out to be little more than expressions of U.S. preferences that hurt American economic interests without, right? Hurt American economic interests without changing the target behaviors, changing the behavior of the target country for the better. Stop quote. I find this fascinating. I don't know about you, especially given what's going on right now. The era of sanctions, our top focus tonight. This is RT America. Here's John Bolton last night. He's in Miami. He's firing up the Hispanic conservative base to go out and vote Republican, by golly.
The troika of tyranny in this hemisphere, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, has finally met its match. Oppressive regimes and ideologies, forces of oppression, totalitarianism, and domination. They worship a false god. We know their day of reckoning awaits. The Nicaraguan regime, like Venezuela and Cuba, will feel the full weight of America's robust sanctions regime. We will no longer appease dictators and despots near our shores.
The election is Tuesday, in case somebody was counting. So Bolton is threatening more sanctions on Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. But the threat does not end there. Just listen to how many countries the Trump administration has now threatened with sanctions, even some allies in many cases. Here it is.
Iran, for many decades, has been the world's central banker of international terrorism.
Russia has been aggressive.
China! They're draining us, they're taking our money, they're rebuilding themselves.
The European Union, of course, was set up to take advantage of the United States, to attack our piggy bank, right? And you know what? We can't let that happen.
Canada, what they've done to our dairy farm workers is a disgrace.
And now this is the list of countries. We just did the research on this in case you wanted us to do it for you. We've got the information. These are countries in the world that the United States now have sanction or embargoes on. You ready? Belarus, Cuba, Eritrea, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Venezuela, Russia, Burma, Cote d'Ivoire. I think I pronounced that right. If I didn't, please let me know. Congo, Eritrea, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Liberia, Libya, North Korea, not finished, China, Somalia, and Sudan. And wait, there's one more. This morning, the United States threatened sanctions against the entire international court. For more on this now, we go to Charles Ortel. He's a political commentator, and he's good enough to join us. And I can't help but wonder, as I'm reading this list, and I used the term earlier, whether this is sanction mania. What's your response?
Well, I think that we need to remember there are 200 countries in the world, and you just listed about 15 by my count, maybe 20. It's sad that in that list, without picking on individual names, there certainly are countries run by aggressive dictatorial despots. In some cases, the United States has tolerated this behavior, and indeed some of those countries, Iraq was a country, for example, that we supported with enormous amounts of blood and treasure in the ill-advised Iraq war that began when it began there in 2003. So to see them now being under sanction, that doesn't speak well of the success of our foreign policy, certainly with regard to Iraq. So I take the point that sanctions very frequently do not work. But in the case of North Korea, I think that you have to say that Trump's more aggressive approach, or the Trump administration's more aggressive approach, certainly has brought our discussions with the leader of North Korea to a different place. Miles remain for us to get to real progress, but I would argue that sanctions have worked there. Where they tend not to work is with the bigger countries, Russia, China, and certainly, perhaps, if it ever gets to the European Union, it won't work there.
You know, I was reading this morning about some of the, what the Brookings Institute says. I don't know how you feel about them, but they do go on to say that for the most part, sanctions make a lot of noise, but they don't really show a lot of results in the end. Do you agree with that?
I think historically that has been true, but the United States, one set of data that I find very interesting and useful is put out by UNCTAD. It breaks down all the countries of the world, their economies by component, going right the way back to 1970. And what you see there is the U.S. market is very, very different than the market in any other country. It is gigantic. It is much bigger than the next, much bigger than China's consumption market. So what Donald Trump has at this moment, and things could change, is an enormous weapon. Around the world, we built too much capacity in industry after industry, in China especially. You cut off access to the U.S. market, it's going to hurt China a lot more than anything China might do vis-a-vis U.S. people trying to tap into their very small market compared to ours.
You know what a lot of people would ask when they look at this situation? They would ask, it's not a question of which countries you have sanctions against. It's actually more of a question of which countries you don't have sanctions against. Like, it's almost like we pick and choose based on what? You tell me. Economic interests?
Well, I'm sure you're going to ask me about Saudi Arabia, and, you know, there it is a very leaping ahead.
It's funny that you're asking yourself the question you knew I was coming back with. Well done, touche.
But, you know, in that instance, you know, the relationship that the United States has had with the Saudi monarchy going back a very long time is a relationship that should be validly questioned, especially in 2018. Why does it make sense in 2018 to embrace monarchies as countries with which we want to build a firm future? Yes, it was attractive to see the young prince, and he may now not be the future king, but pushing his father and pushing his family to drag Saudi Arabia closer to where it should be, into, let's say, 1990 instead of 18 or 1690 or even earlier than that. Yes, that's refreshing, but on the other hand, do we know the real story of tortured relations between the Saudi interests and uniparty interests, frankly, Democrat and Republican, that have allowed this regime to do what it's done for so long to so many people?
Yeah, sometimes I don't know if it's a combination of irony or hypocrisy, but either one, it's always something that we have to be mindful of. Charles Ortel, political commentator, thank you so much for taking time to share some of your wisdom on this with us.
My pleasure.
بذنوبك بسهلك بحبك